I've got my third and final student for the day up, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to Janine. She's working at Queen Mary University in London, and you're working on bluebells, am I right?
Yeah, that's true. I'm a PhD student in evolutionary biology and genetics, and I have a general interest in processes that lead to speciation, but also in processes what happens between different species, like hybridization. So in this particular project, I'm studying hybridization between bluebells in Spain, because there is the Spanish bluebell as well as the British bluebell.
So we're going to start from the beginning. So the first stage in this area of work is field work, right?
Yes.
And have you been out in the field?
Yes. So a few years ago, 2 years ago, we went out to northern Spain, and we wanted to collect leaf material of bluebells. And it's a huge difference whether you want to go and collect bluebells in the UK compared to Spain. You can see in this picture that there's only a tiny blue spot where you see the bluebells actually flowering, and in the UK you would have a forest which is just blue at the carpet. So you really have to develop an eye for bluebells, and I've been told to have that, luckily.
Congratulations, well done.
So yeah, we were just driving around in the cars, and one of my colleagues were getting the material out that we need to collect, and usually it was just like, stop, bluebells, and then we got started with collecting the leaf material. Yes.
So you collected the leaf material,
yeah.
And when you were doing this in particularly focused areas, right? Because as you said, we're looking at two separate species and their hybridization.
Yes.
So it's a bit of a complicated map, but this shows us where those different two species were located, right?
Yes, exactly. So this is also already implementing some of the results that we had. So you see Spain, and you see the square highlighting the area where we actually went out to collect, and the yellow dots on the map represent the occurrences of the the British bluebell to the north, and the blue ones are the Spanish bluebell, and in between the green
Triangles?
Thanks.
Triangles.
The hybrid locations, and we used in the field the characteristics of the flowers to identify them.
Okay, so we're starting with the two separate species, right? And which one have we got on the left here?
Yeah, so very characteristic for the British bluebell is when you turn over the flower and you look inside, it's white, creamish pollen color. The Spanish bluebell, in contrast, has a dark, rich blue pollen color, as you can see in this picture really nicely, comparing these two. And when we went into the field, we started to realize the closer we come to the border between the two species, that the morphologies of the flowers change slightly and they become intermediate. So next picture would be an example of that, where we found a hybrid individual which has both anther colors. This is quite a rare example of what we found in the field. Mostly the pollen color would be greenish, so kind of as if you mix white and blue or yellow and blue together.
So we were talking about speciation earlier. So we've obviously got two starting species, and these are now cross-pollinating. Have we produced a third species now?
No, we're not there.
Could we be there? Where are we?
No, well, in the process of speciation, you have like one species and it gradually becomes two. So that means they're becoming more genetically distinct, and there is a point when these two different genomes, they can't mix anymore. But if they come together before we reach this point of let's say finished speciation, they're still able to hybridize, and this is the point where we are looking at into the hybrid zone in northern Spain, because we think during glaciation that these two species have been apart, but now since we are in a warmer climate, the habitat became available again, so they're like spreading their range or like expanding their range, coming back together, and now we can see those hybrids because they haven't completely separated as a species. But we're still talking about two parent species, and yeah, we are interested in the processes of these hybrids to see how much do they actually change the genetic composition of either species, and just what's going on in terms of genes that are passed on from one species to the other, and those hybrids are just really valuable samples to look into this.
Okay, so small question before we move on. The hybrid species, does that mean that they're not fertile?
Oh, that's a very good question. We found out that they are fertile, and we can
But
get
they're still
many...
not a species.
No, they're not a species. We can get many generations of hybrids, and they happily backcross with their parents. And yeah.
Okay, it's a very grey area, isn't it, this?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so your particular work, now that you've been involved in the field work and people are presumably still doing that, what are you looking at now?
Yeah, so the next step, as we've heard before, like some other projects, is you go into the lab and you extract DNA. So the next step then is some bioinformatics and DNA sequencing. So
bioinformatics, going back to earlier, that's analysing the biological data using computer systems.
yes,
Okay.
exactly. And we are specifically interested in genes which are kind of changing the flower morphology and which are generally have an impact on pollinator interaction, because the pollen is actually quite important across the hybrid zone as a mediator for gene flow, so how genes get passed on from one direction to the other. So we are looking into mutations specifically for each parent in those genes, and then we want to look in the hybrid zone or in the hybrids which of these mutations occur, and just to trace which genes get passed on in which direction.
So you're looking at the genetic data, and you mentioned genes affecting pollination, and presumably that's because that's the way that genetic information is passed on to the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
So are you specifically looking for areas in the genome, in all of the genetic data, to seek those out? How are you doing that?
Well, that's quite a long process of bioinformatics again. So there are databases which have identified in other species so-called flowering genes, so genes that are involved in flower morphology, scents and things. You look up in the databases the genes and compare them to the data that I got back from the lab.
Okay.
Just by comparison, I would find out those genes. And then I look a bit closer into specific mutations that are telling the parents apart. Like I could say, okay, this is...
So are we talking about good mutations or bad mutations here, or are they indifferent?
They're mutual. I mean, they could alter the protein sequence, but they don't necessarily have to. So it's nothing like a disease or anything. It's more like, is it variant A or variant B?
Okay, because mutations generally people think of as bad things, especially when we're talking about genetics.
Yeah.
But genetic mutations that maybe aren't actually having much of an effect on the final plant that we see, or maybe it's only affecting the colour or something that maybe wouldn't be of that much interest outside of this sort of context. Okay.
Yeah.
And why is this work important? What are you hoping to achieve through your research?
Yeah, so one is the hybrid zone itself in northern Spain. Just interested in why did it happen, why do we see it right now. But it's also quite an interesting system comparing to the UK, because in this hybrid zone here, we think there is very little impact of the humans. So the spread of the hybrids as well as the parent species is really natural and has been there for quite a long time, like 10,000 years. In the UK, on the other side, we have a Spanish bluebell hybrid variety that has been introduced to the UK, and by people planting these bluebells in their gardens, and then they escape and then they become natural, they slowly and gradually spread out into the bluebell forests. And this process is hugely impacted by how many people plant those Spanish varieties in their gardens, and we hope that getting some estimates for like gene flow and which genes are important for the hybridization in bluebells from Spain, that we could actually predict something about the UK.
So we're looking at a completely natural environment where we're actually not worried that we've got this hybrid species, because we're happy with both species being there and this happening. But in the UK, we are concerned about it because actually we know that humans are the reason that this has happened, because we introduced the Spanish bluebell. Okay, so it's weird that it's a problem and something we want to address in the UK, only because we know that humans have interfered. It's quite an interesting scenario to be working on. Well, brilliant. It's great that it has such a relevant application. So thank you for telling us about your work. Can we have a big round of applause?